Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the podcast. Today is a topic that was hotly requested by the community, as it were. A while back, me and Joris recorded a Meet the Team podcast, and we answered some community questions in regards to how the game functions, the tech side of it. And it got over so well that we figured we might as well bring in the two people who know the tech best. That would be Joris and Loren, and I'm going to just let them loose on the topic. So today, we're going to be discussing the netcode and essentially how to keep an MMO afloat. Gentlemen, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you, Svetlin.
So, with that in mind, we have a couple of topics we want to discuss that you guys picked out as something that interests you. So, lead in with the proxy zones. What are the proxy zones?
All right, well, those are technically two different things, Svetlin.
Proxies and zones, I know. I have just written it down badly because I'm a fantastic host.
Well, yeah, you want to jump in, Loren? Go for it.
Oh yeah. Well, I thought I'd give the basics, right? So, basically, when you look at the big picture of hosting an MMO, there's a couple of challenges that you run into, and one of which is that despite the fantastically powerful server hardware that we have today, that still does not mean you can host like 100,000 live players in a single world on a single machine. So we're always dealing with the fact that we're going to need more than one server to host all these players. In fact, we're going to need a hell of a lot more servers than that. And this is kind of where zones and proxies come in. And, I'd actually pass it off to Joris, have him maybe talk about that a little bit, about, why we have these zone servers, which should be pretty clear given the fact that we cannot have you all on one server, so we must somehow spread it, and then how proxies come in and how they do their magic to somehow create an experience where despite us having you on many different servers, you still have some kind of a consistent game experience.
All right. So a zone is basically a game server. It manages a zone of the game map. So if you're in a city, that city might be managed in a specific zone server. And the proxy is what you connect to, which then proxies or forwards your messages to the right zone, the right area you are in the or in the game. So when you're moving around, you might move from zone to zone, but you always stay connected to the same proxy. So the proxy forwards then forwards your messages to the new zone you're in, like when you moved out of the city. And that happens completely seamlessly, so you transition from one server to another without actually realizing, because the game client stays connected to the proxy. You never reconnect to a different server. It just forwards it to a different zone. Hope that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, I think, and actually kind of harkening back to something that I discussed with Svetlin on another podcast, was this notion of, like, in the olden days, like in games like Neocron, which I worked on, when this type of technology was not yet available, we literally had like things like synchronizing and loading between the different zones of the world, right? So you were literally walking through this virtual border, and then suddenly it was like, oh crap, we need to put you on another server. And also, I think what's probably interesting to maybe touch on yours is that you're not necessarily only connected to one zone at a time, are you, right? You might also be seeing things in other zones, right?
Yeah, so it's a bit of an edge case, but if you are on the edge between two zones, so you're about to leave the city, but you're technically still in the city, at that point, the proxy forwards your messages to basically two zones, to the one in the city and the one just outside of the city. So you get updates from both at the same time, but the client would never realize or notice. It's all a seamless experience.
So if I'm understanding correctly from a user's perspective, that means that as you're approaching the border of one game zone going into another, instead of, waiting for a loading screen, the game determines where you're going and dynamically loads what you're heading towards, correct?
Yes.
Oh, succinct. Pretty easy to explain.
Yeah. And to some extent, even more cool, it's almost the proxy that is doing the thinking for you and says, you know what, everything that's just outside of the city, I should start sending you data about that so you can actually see it, so that when you step outside of the city, it isn't like suddenly out of nowhere a giant gruff boss appears in front of you and smacks you in the face. Which, may sound funny, but in some of these olden days MMOs, there was no such thing as cross-zone connectivity, so the best thing we could kind of do is put a little dark alleyway between two zones, right? Where there would not usually be anything there to smash you in the face when you switch from server to server.
Yeah, or the really long elevators. Every game, the long elevator rides.
I mean,
it's a little bit different in an MMO because of the connection issues, but loading and streaming in data, it's so obvious in older games.
Oh yeah, very true, very true. I mean, obviously there's more than just the networking data that needs to come in. You need to load data into that other zone, and indeed that means that even single player games have these typical the Mass Effect elevator ride where depending on how powerful your PC is, you can either spend 5 seconds in this elevator or 5 minutes in it, right? They have very variable speeds depending on what player is in the elevator.
So how do we make sure that people have... Because Ember Sword is going to be a social game, correct? Well, for the most part, you're going to be in a party. How do we ensure that people have such a seamless experience when they're essentially on different internet connections?
So that kind of touches into, I guess, a little bit of latency correction and how we deal with slow connections in general, right? Just making sure that everything feels seamless, even if you have a really slow and shitty internet connection. So the proxy partially comes into play here. I'm going to do my very best to explain this as easily as possible, but it's a little bit complicated. Because it's an MMO, we host a server in one centralized location. So for example, in the Netherlands, which is a common place to host servers. So if you're connecting from Spain, you go to your internet service provider and then you go over the public internet all the way to the Netherlands and then connect to the server, which comes with a certain amount of latency. What we can do is we can host the zones, which are the game server and the game logic, host those in the Netherlands and then put a proxy in Spain. So you connect from Spain to the Spanish proxy and then it goes over a private network connection, for example, from the Google data center, over the private internet connection all the way to Amsterdam. So the latency actually gets reduced because of this proxy setup as well. And then you want to touch on the other one, Loren?
Oh yeah, no, I think that was a very succinct sort of description of indeed how proxies help you reduce latency. It's kind of like, we can put proxies around the world and they're your local linkage to then a high-speed link to the zones, right? But then obviously a latency correction comes in, which I think is also equally interesting. So you take that one away, yours, and I'll complement as we go.
All right, sure. So some latency is obviously unavoidable, right? That's just physics. So to make it feel nice for the player, there's some things we can do, which is, for example, client-side prediction. So what we can do on the client is figure out if a client can do a certain thing on the client itself. So I have enough health, I have enough mana, so I can probably do this attack. We can figure that out in the client, and then we just start playing that attack already and simultaneously send a message to the server, and then we wait for the server to confirm if that was actually correct or not. If our prediction was wrong and we weren't allowed to do that ability, we basically roll back the client. So we undo that ability that you were about to do. If it is correct, you could just continue to let it play, and then the animations on the game client and on the server will actually line up. So when your sword hits a creature, it actually deals damage at that same time, regardless of how much latency you have.
Yeah, very true. And one of the interesting things about that is actually, kind of in an MMO game like that on the client side, it's almost like we're doing a lot of bookkeeping just so we can kind of roll things back if we get it wrong. But the beauty of things is that in reality, obviously, we don't get it wrong very often. 99% of the time, that prediction that you're able to do that, unless you're cheating, right? Then your game experience is, you've deserved to have your game experience ruined if you're doing that, right? But unless you're cheating, 99% of the time we're in the right. So what the game client is showing you is working out perfectly, and you're seeing a beautiful, smooth movement, even though, for another player, that attack might happen a little later or a little earlier, or, et cetera, right? These kinds of things don't matter in the grand scheme of things, as long as we, on the one hand, offer a smooth experience, and on the other hand, keep what we in gaming refer to as an authoritative server, which basically means the server is the big boss of everything that happens, right? You can't be a client and say, and funny notion, I've worked on some games where you could do that. In fact, when I originally was in the beta test of Neocron, there was a distinct example of something that we would call non-server authoritative or even client authoritative logic in there, which was basically in this packet that you sent when you damaged someone. So basically, in Neocron, they thought it would be very helpful to, when you dealt damage to a player, to send a nice little package to the server saying, I hit Joris for 9,000 points of damage. And then, the funny thing is that in the initial logic, just to save time, some of the network programmers were just like, yeah, why would anyone lie about that? Let's just deal 9,000 damage to Joris whenever someone says that. So somewhere mid-beta, I figured out that I could also send that package and just include the list of all the players in the entire zone and say, I did unlimited damage to everyone. And then everyone would drop dead. Which was really bad for, they had a PK gauge, like player killing gauge, which was called Soul Light, that would obviously diminish if you were randomly murdering your fellow citizens. As you can imagine, upon me sending a couple of these packets in a 200 player zone, my Soul Light hit sort of a negative infinity number. But that is the difference between, server authoritative versus client authoritative. So what we're doing with Ember Sword is, in the end, if our server says, no, you're a liar, you couldn't have hit him, you couldn't have used that ability, obviously we will just rewind whatever happened on the client to make it right again. And that is one of the key tenets of designing let's say a secure MMO.
How would that look like in gameplay terms, that rewind?
Actually, one thing just quickly throwing in,
Sure,
I mean,
go ahead.
Neocron was an older game, right? But even The Division, which is a AAA game, had client-side authoritative network models.
Seriously?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure it was about how much ammo you had in your gun and things like that. So you never had to reload; you could just keep shooting, and it was just.
Oh my god, Ubisoft! Why?
It's really scary. But there were also, for example, around the time of Counter-Strike Global Offensive and such, there were Counter-Strike clones in Korea and also some indeed AAA games that just shipped with peer-to-peer even client authoritative, obviously, because when it's peer-to-peer, there's not even a server involved. It's just all the clients are connecting to each other and saying, shall we play a game together? And then, literally one of those clients would just simply say to all the other clients, yeah, I just stabbed you in the back for 1 million damage. And everyone would drop dead. And, obviously, when it comes to hacking, these games are a scourge to play. I would say almost at some point for hobby purposes, I contributed to it, but no one saw those in public, where I was just literally sitting together with a group of guys who really loved breaking games horribly, and we took this Korean game called War Rock, which was basically a Counter-Strike clone, and that was entirely peer-to-peer. Oh, you remember that one?
Oh, I remember it, yeah.
It was so brilliant. I can see if we can still dig up one of the hacks, but basically their main form of security was Punkbuster, which was checking if you were not modifying any of the instructions in your executable, right? So instead I built a program that used the hardware breakpoints in your CPU. So there's this thing that basically allows you to halt your processor on a particular instruction that's literally in the hardware of your processor, and then you can just stop it. You can change whatever is in the memory of the processor, and you can continue it along a bit further. And this was completely undetectable by Punkbuster and just allowed us to change anything that was happening in the network packets in the world. So I literally had, for example, one button on my keyboard, and when I pressed it, my character would be placed about a mile underneath the game world with all the other players in a circle around me, just in order of player ID, doing the animation that they were doing in the real world, and then I would just take out my knife and decide who had to die. and I could also just drop a grenade on the floor there, and my game client would basically tell tell you all players in the server died because a grenade exploded at their feet.
So I think this is a good example why server authoritative is the way to go.
Yeah, exactly. But it is shocking, right? That even like on very modern games like The Division, sometimes even just by accident, maybe not even intentionally, people think, oh, it probably won't be harmful to do that stuff on the client, and then suddenly someone has infinite ammo and no reload.
Wonderful.
Oops.
Well, to get back to the question that applies to somebody like me who has a vague understanding of the systems at best, how does the rolling back look in gameplay terms? Once for example, the server determines that no, this should not happen.
I mean, it looks a little bit jarring to the player. There's really no way around it. Like, imagine you start. We have one ability where you like jump to a location and you crash on the ground and you do a bunch of damage on impact. Like, imagine the client predicts that it can do that, and then it jumps forward to where it's about to crash land, but then the server says nope. So then we have to reset you to where you were, right? We have to roll you back to a proper location. So it's always going to look a bit jarring. But as long as the prediction is good, then it would really only happen if you have a lot of latency or you're cheating.
Yeah, exactly. Sort of the trick of a lot of these things is that you almost never see them happen. Hence, it's like, oh crap, I had a lag spike and some things jumped, right? And that occurs to you, once, twice a day. That typically is kind of the peak of that experience. I did, though, want to dive back into the proxy and zone part a little bit, because I didn't want to let Joris off that easy, right? Because obviously Joris was saying yeah, it's kind of like a zone is a city, and then when you step outside of the city, you're in another zone, right? But I just wanted to show people that the rabbit hole goes just a little bit deeper than that, because obviously, or as you may imagine, what if 10,000 people decide to go into that city? Do we then have that same problem, or is it really the case that we're operating on a slightly different level than just cities?
I mean, we can go that deep, sure. So in the scenario of a lot of people gathering in one place, like a city, we can actually do two things. We can either subdivide our zone. So basically, we just split the zone into multiple servers and then offload people onto those servers, right? So we make more smaller zones, which each is its own server, so then we can handle more players, if that makes sense. Another option is sharding, which basically means we spin up an entirely new universe and then put people in the new universe, essentially, right? And then people in different universes or in different shards can't see each other.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it might be a good comparison for people, maybe if we keep the sharding on the side, because that's, I think, a well understood notion that if you just create an additional world, right, that we have plenty of space for new players in that world. But the interesting bit is actually that when you look at what a zone server does, a zone is not actually technically a city. A zone is responsible for a bunch of cells of the world, a bunch of almost rectangles of the game world that are living inside that zone server. So actually, technically, when you say a zone is like a city, that probably just means that particular zone server is owning all the sort of rectangles of the game world, all the squares of the game world that happen to make up that city. But the beautiful,
fair enough. Yep.
Yeah, exactly. But the beautiful thing is actually that if you look at the way these zone servers work, is they can kind of pass these little puzzle pieces of the world, back and forth along them, saying, hey, you take care of this now, it's getting too busy for me. So realistically, actually, it's, that city might be composed out of 1,000 little puzzle pieces of the world, some no much bigger than a screen, right? And the zone servers could decide to rebalance those amongst each other in order to ensure that they could serve a large amount of players.
Yeah. There's obviously a bit of overhead of having to move players from one server to another. So we try to avoid this as much as possible. So in most cases, it's easiest to just take the entire zone and just split it up into 4. And then, load people off into the different servers, and then you can subdivide a few times until it gets so small that you get to the single cellular level, like one cell is roughly one screen size. At that point, you just can't divide any smaller, and then you have to start sharding.
Yeah. Although the upside is usually that, if you look at the amount of players,
it's very rare.
yeah, if
It's
you look at
almost
the amount of
impossible.
players that fit on a screen, you could serve all of those from a single machine.
Yeah,
And that's the good thing. That's kind of how we do what we like to call infinite scalability, right? Kind of this notion of, well, you just physically cannot pack enough players together in order to overload our servers. Because we'll just, that place where you've packed all these players together, that, just that one screen will be handled by one whole server just dedicated to that screen if we have to. It's not ideal, but don't mess with us.
Don't put out that challenge. Somebody is definitely going to take it up. Although, if you think you have around 10 million friends to dump on Ember Sword to try and crash us, please, by all means, be our guest.
Fair enough. Yeah.
Yeah, we would love to see that happen in the bed. Actually, that's our challenge to you. Like, make these servers come down. I mean, just see if we can pile up 10,000 people on the screen. We welcome you to try that challenge.
We double dog dare you.
We're going to regret this. I'm
The
telling
toppest tier of dog.
I know, but we will dedicate a podcast or a video to it. Scout's honor when our early access fans get to that point and just downright nuke our server by every one of them standing on top of a tiny little rock together or something. I'm already looking forward to it.
We just made Joris's nights in future very, very long by doing this.
There go my evenings.
I'm sorry, man. So, there was one more thing in the docket I wanted to discuss, which you guys suggested, which is something called areas of interest.
Yeah, that was something that we actually touched upon kind of already. But when you talk about something like an area of interest, that has everything to do with those little cells in the zone, right? The area of interest is really nothing more than saying, hey, if I'm standing near the edge of the city, right, I should be able to see outside of it. And thus, that area outside the city is in my area of interest. And so somehow this proxy server that is funneling all this game data to me should be really smart and should be connecting the zone to the zone server that has that area in it, right? That has that cell in it, and say, hey, I want that data to now also be sent to Loren because he needs to see what's there. So we kind of, covered it just indirectly through talking through the proxy and zone. And there is, by the way, something interesting about this, and it's another way, just to make things a little easier for yours when everyone comes in with 10,000 players and tries to crash the game. Areas of interest is actually also a way we can scale the load on the network and the load for you for your experience as a player. So if you come into areas that are extremely busy, extremely densely populated, we can, if necessary, kind of shrink your area of interest, saying, hey, anything that's even a little bit off screen we're maybe not interested in, or anything that's not close enough to the player to be directly interacting with them, maybe we want to give less updates per second of that, instead of 30,
I was
we'll
about to
give
bring
10
that up.
updates for that.
Yeah, we can do throttling in really busy areas. We can just, in the city, maybe you only get 10 updates per second, but then outside of the city in a combat scenario, you bump back up to the normal 30.
So in terms of that, once inevitably thousands of people try and occupy one space, we've touched upon this in a sense, right? Where I know that since the game is isometric, there is only so many people that can fit on a single screen. But
yeah, exactly. We're counting on that to save Joris' ass big time.
So if I'm understanding correctly, even with the maximum amount of players on screen, there shouldn't be any noticeable slowdown, provided your internet connection is good, right?
I would say, and your graphics card isn't choking up from having 900 bloody players on the screen that are all doing special abilities and trying to crash your computer. But there is such a there is an extent to which we as game developers can try to accommodate, And then eventually, if you're playing on your grandpa's PC and there's 900 players going around the screen, yeah, you may not be in for the greatest time regardless. We'll just try to make it as best as possible. But there is limits.
Of course, but again, we've maintained this, and every time, this particular topic has been brought up, we've maintained that we're going to be trying our best, and really that's all we can hope for, right?
Definitely.
Hell yeah. Okay, well, that, I guess, covers the topics we had lined up for today. Do you guys have anything else that you want to discuss before we wrap this up?
I don't know, Joris. Are you getting nervous yet with what we've put in motion here?
I'm starting to sweat a little bit, yeah.
Okay, good. So I suggest that next week's podcast we cover ways you might try to fork our blockchain and ruin, ownership of items and a few more issues like that, Joris. Maybe we can already start preparing the community for potential rewards for early access players that manage to really break all the stuff you're doing.
This has been great.
My pleasure.
Joris was just disappeared, never to be heard from again. This turned into the X-Files real quick. Okay, well, I guess this wraps up the podcast. Thank you, gentlemen, for participating. Thank you for shedding some light on how Ember Sword's world works in terms of the tech behind it, in terms of the netcode, and thank you for shedding light on what people might expect once they inevitably land in a zone with 10 quadrillion people in it.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Our pleasure, Svetlin.
I can just hear the trepidation in your voice here. I'm sorry for the nightmares. So yeah, thank you for participating. Hey you made it to the end. Congratulations. That must mean you like us enough to want more, right? Well, good news. We're all over the internet. Go to embersword.com and subscribe to our newsletter for a chance to play the game early, as well as the latest interesting tidbits on the game and the team. Join our lovely Discord community over at discord.gg/embersword. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook at PlayEmberSword for regular updates on what we're up to. And remember the basics. Drink water, be kind to each other, and spread the word about Ember Sword.